Imagine a small American town where everyone knows each other, a place with just a few hundred residents, surrounded by quiet farmland, where life moves slowly and nothing extraordinary ever seems to happen. Now, imagine that almost overnight, that same town becomes a destination for people from across the entire United States and eventually from around the world. Cars line the country roads, strangers fill the streets, hundreds of visitors pour into a small church night after night, and all of it begins with one simple Sunday evening service. In a nation built on freedom of belief and the power of faith, stories like this remind many Americans why the church has always been at the heart of their communities. This is the remarkable true story of the revival that transformed a quiet Missouri town and drew more than 250,000 people to a place most had never even heard of before: Smithton. In the mid-1990s, Smithton, Missouri was the kind of town that rarely made the news. With a population of only 532 people, it was a peaceful rural community where families had lived for generations, and the rhythm of life was shaped by farms, small businesses, and Sunday church services. In the center of town stood Smithton Community Church, a modest congregation of around 180 members. It wasn't a famous church or a large ministry. It was simply the spiritual home for many of the town's residents. For more than 13 years, the church had been led by its pastor, Steve Gray, a man who had faithfully served the community, but who, by 1996, had quietly reached one of the lowest points of his life. After more than a decade of ministry, Gray had become deeply discouraged. Leading a small-town church can be rewarding, but it can also be exhausting. And over the years, criticism and conflict had slowly worn him down. Even though the church was doing reasonably well for a town of that size, he felt that he had reached the limit of his emotional strength. In his own mind, he had nothing left to give. The pressure had grown so intense that he eventually stepped away from the church for 2 weeks, spending much of that time alone and searching for clarity about whether he should continue in ministry at all. During that time, he also traveled to Florida, where a powerful spiritual movement known as the Brownsville Revival was drawing thousands of people in the city of Pensacola. The experience stirred something inside him again, something that looked a lot like hope. When Gray returned to Smithton on March 24, 1996, the congregation gathered as they normally would for a Sunday evening service. No one expected anything unusual that night. The church had held countless services before, and most of them followed the same simple routine. But the moment Gray stepped through the doors of the sanctuary, something happened that would change the history of that small church forever. Later, he would describe the moment as feeling like the lightning of God. Overwhelmed with joy and emotion, he suddenly began jumping and celebrating as he entered the room. The congregation immediately sensed that something extraordinary was unfolding before them. People began moving toward the front of the church, some removing their shoes as they prayed and worshiped. What started as a normal service quickly turned into an intense spiritual gathering that no one present would ever forget. Word about what happened that night began spreading far beyond the town limits. At first, people from nearby communities came to see what was happening in Smithton. Then, visitors started arriving from other parts of Missouri. Before long, people were traveling from every corner of the United States. The church began holding services 6 nights a week to accommodate the crowds, and it was common for between 600 and 1,000 visitors to attend on any given night. For a town with barely 500 residents, the sudden influx of people was astonishing. The quiet rural roads of Smithton were suddenly filled with cars from dozens of different states, and the small church building was packed with people searching for the same spiritual experience they had heard about from friends, pastors, and traveling visitors. Over the next few years, the revival continued to grow in ways that few could have imagined when it first began. Visitors didn't just come from across America, they began arriving from across the world. People traveled from countries such as Australia, France, Germany, Israel, Singapore, and Japan to witness what was happening inside that small Missouri church. For many of them, the journey was fueled by a deep curiosity about the power of faith communities in the United States, where freedom of religion had long allowed churches to become central gathering places for millions of believers. By the time the revival had run its course, more than 250,000 people had visited Smithton Community Church, turning the tiny farming town into an unexpected international destination. Eventually, the success of the revival created challenges that the small town simply couldn't handle. The crowds that poured into Smithton every week often outnumbered the town's entire population, and the constant flow of visitors began to strain the community's resources. What had once been a quiet farming town suddenly found itself at the center of a national spiritual movement. The narrow country roads that led into Smithton, once used mostly by farmers and local residents, were now filled with vehicles arriving from every corner of the country. On many nights, cars stretched for miles along the rural highways as people searched for a place to park before walking toward the small church that had become the focus of so much attention. For longtime residents, the change felt almost surreal. Smithton had always been a place where life moved slowly and predictably. Neighbors knew each other by name, and most evenings were quiet. But during the years of the revival, the town experienced something entirely different. Visitors began arriving not just from nearby communities, but from distant states across America. Families drove for hours, sometimes even days, to see for themselves what was happening in this small Missouri church. Some came out of curiosity, others came searching for hope, and many arrived simply because they had heard stories from friends or pastors who had already attended the gatherings. As word continued to spread, the revival began attracting international visitors as well. People traveled from countries such as Australia, France, Germany, Singapore, Israel, and Japan, turning the quiet rural town into an unexpected destination for believers from around the world. For a place with only a few hundred residents, the sudden influx of people created scenes that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. Fields near the church filled with parked cars, and the roads leading into town were often lined with vehicles late into the evening. Inside the church, the atmosphere remained intense and deeply emotional. Services were held multiple times each week, and many of them lasted for hours. Worship, prayer, and personal testimonies became central parts of the gatherings, and visitors frequently described the experience as something they had never witnessed before. For many people, attending a service in Smithton became a moment they would remember for the rest of their lives. By the year 2000, however, the scale of the revival had grown beyond what the small town could realistically sustain. The leadership of the church faced a difficult decision. The movement was still attracting large crowds, but the limited space and infrastructure of the rural community made it increasingly difficult to accommodate everyone who wanted to attend. After much discussion, the church eventually chose to relocate to a larger city, where the ministry could continue without overwhelming the small town that had hosted the revival for so many years. Most of the congregation moved together to a new location in Kansas City, Missouri, where the ministry continued under a new name and with more space for the growing number of people interested in the movement. Although the revival eventually changed locations, the story of what happened in Smithton remains one of the most remarkable examples of how a small community can suddenly become the center of something much larger. What began as an ordinary Sunday night service in a quiet rural church eventually drew more than 250,000 visitors to a town of just a few hundred residents. For many who were there, the events in Smithton served as a powerful reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin in the most ordinary places.